At night, my daughter and her husband screamed my name from the porch, demanding I open the door. I didn't answer. I stood in the dark hallway of my townhouse in Asheville, listening to the sound of entitlement scraping against the wood like fingernails. By morning, every lock in the house had been replaced. The quiet felt earned, like breath returning after a long compression. That evening, my son-in-law came back with an axe, heavy in his hands, certainty in his stride, promising to break in and take what he had already decided was his. I opened the door first. I didn't step aside. I didn't explain. I simply revealed what had been standing behind me all along. Preparation, patience, and proof. Before I tell you how it came to this, I ask you for something simple. If you've ever been cornered by the people who should have protected you, stay with me. Subscribe, and if this story touches a nerve, share your own in the comments. Sometimes survival begins when someone else finally listens. Earlier that day, I had been awake since before sunrise, sitting at the small kitchen table that faced the narrow strip of trees behind my townhouse. Asheville mornings usually carried a quiet dignity. Fog clinging low, birds testing the air, but my body didn't share the calm. The pressure in my chest had been coming and going for weeks, the kind that didn't announce itself loudly enough to be dramatic, but persistent enough to demand respect. That was why the cardiology appointment mattered. It wasn't precautionary. It wasn't routine. It was necessary. I had dressed carefully, the way men do when they know they'll be sitting across from professionals who speak in numbers and margins of error. Clean shirt, sweater folded over the back of the chair. Medication counted twice and placed beside a paper cup of coffee that I poured too early. By 9 o'clock, the coffee had cooled. By 10, it was bitter. By 11, it was just something to hold so my hands didn't betray me. Megan was supposed to arrive at 9 sharp. She had insisted on driving me herself. Said it casually, like it was an obvious duty, something she was generously taking off my plate. I remember feeling a brief, foolish warmth at that, relief that my daughter was stepping in, that maybe I hadn't raised someone who saw me only as a problem to be solved later. By noon, that warmth had thinned into something uncomfortable. I texted once. No response. I didn't call. I had learned over time that calling only made things worse. It introduced urgency where none was welcome. It forced people to acknowledge you in real time, and I had already sensed that real time was not something I was entitled to anymore. When Megan finally arrived, it was with momentum meant for somewhere else. The door opened and closed in one smooth motion, like she was passing through a corridor instead of entering her father's home. She smelled faintly of perfume, expensive, deliberate. Her jacket was tailored, her shoes impractical for anything other than being seen. She didn't look late. She looked preoccupied. Ryan followed her inside without pausing. He didn't greet me. He didn't meet my eyes. He leaned against the counter like he belonged there, scrolling through his phone, absorbed in something that required more of his attention than the man who had paid for the down payment on their first condo. He didn't remove his jacket. He didn't sit. He was already halfway gone. Megan spoke quickly, her words overlapping themselves. She mentioned traffic, an email she hadn't expected, a rooftop fundraiser downtown that she couldn't miss. The cardiology appointment came up last, almost as an afterthought, folded into a sentence about timing conflicts and how these things were always booked too tightly anyway. She said we should reschedule. The word landed wrong. She said the clinic would understand. She said it wasn't urgent. She said they'd call and fix it. Ryan nodded without looking up, already bored with the subject, his thumb moving steadily across the glass of his screen. No one asked how I was feeling. No one asked if I had slept. No one noticed that I was already wearing my coat. I tried to speak once. Not to argue, just to anchor the moment. My voice came out quieter than I expected. Megan didn't hear it, or she chose not to. Either way, the result was the same. They discussed my health the way people discuss a missed delivery. Annoying, inconvenient, easily deferred. I had spent my life believing that showing up, consistently, reliably, earned you a place in the room when decisions were made about you. Sitting there, I realized that belief had expired without my noticing. When they left, it happened quickly. Megan gave me a distracted hug, her body already angled toward the door. She said she'd call later. Ryan was outside before she finished speaking. The door closed behind them with a finality that felt heavier than it should have. The silence afterward was sharp. Not peaceful. Not restful. Sharp. I sat there for a long time, the coat still on my shoulders, the appointment slip folded neatly on the table like evidence of something that no longer mattered. The pressure in my chest lingered, but it wasn't fear of my heart giving out that unsettled me most. It was the clarity that arrived with it. This hadn't been an oversight. It hadn't been bad timing. It was a decision made casually, collectively, that my needs were negotiable, my presence optional. I had not been forgotten. I had been deprioritized. As the afternoon light shifted across the floor, small memories began lining up in my mind, orderly and damning. Missed calls returned days later. Financial conversations redirected without me. Papers placed in front of me with explanations that felt rehearsed. Each moment harmless on its own. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. That afternoon, sitting alone in my kitchen, I understood that something fundamental had changed. I was no longer being treated as a man with agency, history, and authority over his own life. I was being managed, positioned, quietly moved out of the center of my own affairs. And once that understanding settled in, it didn't frighten me. That evening, after the house had settled back into stillness, I took out my laptop and logged into my bank account out of habit more than concern. It was something I did every night, a quiet ritual left over from years of running projects where numbers mattered because people depended on them. I expected nothing unusual. Routine balances, predictable withdrawals. The kind of order that reassures you the world is still obeying its own rules. Instead, I saw an alert I didn't recognize. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't a minor discrepancy that could be dismissed as a billing error or a forgotten subscription. It was a series of charges clustered tightly together, all from the same account I rarely used anymore. An emergency card, one I had given Megan years earlier, back when help meant help and trust didn't require footnotes. I had never revoked it because I had never imagined needing to. The amounts were precise and confident. Thousands at a time. Furniture vendors I didn't frequent. Legal filing services. Appraisal companies. Each transaction sat there calmly, documented and approved, as if daring me to pretend it was accidental. I felt no spike of anger. No rush of adrenaline. What I felt instead was recognition. A slow internal nod. This was not impulsive spending. This was infrastructure. This was preparation. I closed the laptop and sat back, letting the silence do its work. Then I stood and walked down the narrow hallway to the back bedroom, where a closet held things I rarely touched anymore. At the very back, behind winter coats and an old toolbox, was a locked case. I had started assembling it months earlier, after noticing inconsistencies I couldn't quite name at the time. Nothing dramatic, just small fractures in the story I was being told. Inside were printed bank statements annotated by hand. Copies of emails forwarded quietly to an address Megan didn't know existed. Audio logs from voicemails that had struck me as oddly rehearsed. Property documents I had requested under the pretense of updating my records. Individually, each item was harmless. Together, they formed a map. I spread everything out across the dining table, methodical, patient. The pattern was no longer subtle. The purchases aligned with services related to asset transfer. The timing matched periods when my health records showed hospital visits. The language in the emails shifted gradually from collaborative to assumptive, referring to decisions already made, steps already underway. They weren't helping manage my affairs. They were preparing to replace me. There is a particular kind of betrayal that doesn't announce itself with cruelty. It arrives wearing reason. It uses concern as camouflage. It frames control as care. Sitting there, surrounded by my own documentation, I understood that what had been happening wasn't neglect or entitlement. It was strategy. The most unsettling part was how quietly it had been done. No confrontation, no demand, just incremental adjustments made in my absence, banking on the idea that I would continue to defer, to trust, to stay tired enough not to notice. They had mistaken my composure for passivity. I logged back into the account and downloaded everything. I didn't freeze the card yet. I didn't call the bank. I wanted the record intact. I wanted their confidence to continue uninterrupted. People reveal the most when they believe they are already winning. As the night deepened, I reviewed property records next. Public filings are patient things. They wait for anyone willing to look. What I found there didn't surprise me anymore, but it did confirm what I needed to know. Preliminary movements, early drafts, intent without completion. The kind of groundwork laid before someone believes resistance is possible. I sat there until well past midnight, not rushing, not shaking. My heart condition had taught me something useful. Panic wastes oxygen. Precision preserves it. By the time I closed the case and returned it to the closet, the house felt different. Not threatened. Clarified. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was orienting myself. Whatever they believed was already theirs had been built on the assumption that I would remain silent, compliant, and conveniently unwell. That assumption was about to become their most expensive mistake. When I finally turned off the lights and went to bed, I didn't sleep much. Not from fear, from calculation. The shift from suspicion to certainty happened the next morning, quietly, without drama. I was reviewing the documents again when I noticed something I had skimmed past the night before. Not because it was hidden well, but because it had been designed to pass unnoticed. Preliminary filing. Incomplete, but intentional. The kind of paperwork that exists only to test resistance. It was an attempt to amend my property trust. Not finalized, not approved, but initiated. Ryan's name appeared where it had never belonged, inserted with the casual confidence of someone who believed permission was a formality, not a requirement. The filing date made my stomach tighten. It had been submitted while I was hospitalized for cardiac monitoring weeks earlier. A narrow window, carefully chosen. Long enough for me to be inaccessible. Short enough to be explained away as assistance if discovered. The signature stopped me. It was close enough to mine to pass at a glance. Wrong enough to fail scrutiny. The slope of the letters was inconsistent. The pressure uneven. Whoever had practiced it hadn't understood that handwriting is muscle memory, not art. You can mimic the shape, but not the rhythm. I sat back and let that realization settle. This wasn't planning for my benefit. This was acting in anticipation of my absence. Temporary or permanent, it didn't matter which. The assumption was the same. That morning, I didn't call Megan. I didn't confront Ryan. Confrontation invites improvisation, and I had learned long ago that improvisation favors the bold, not the right. Instead, I made a decision I should have made earlier, before politeness had been mistaken for permission. I called a locksmith. He arrived mid-afternoon. A quiet man with deliberate hands who didn't ask unnecessary questions. We replaced every exterior lock. Front door, back door, garage access. I upgraded the deadbolts and reprogrammed the keypad. As he worked, I moved through the house checking windows, securing what I had once assumed didn't need securing. I didn't leave a note. I didn't send a message. I didn't warn anyone that the rules had changed. Boundaries, I had learned, don't need announcements. They need enforcement. When the locksmith finished, the house felt sealed. Not closed off, but restored. Like a structure brought back to code after years of small, tolerated violations. I paid him, thanked him, and watched his truck disappear down the street before I went back inside and locked the door behind me. That evening, I cooked a simple dinner and ate it slowly. Not because I wasn't anxious, but because I was. Deliberate movements steadied my breathing. Calm is not the absence of fear. It's the decision not to let fear dictate pace. Just after nightfall, the shouting started. Megan's voice first. High, sharp, threaded with disbelief. She yelled my name like it was a password she had forgotten. Something she expected would still work if spoken loudly enough. Ryan's voice followed. Angrier, heavier, less controlled. Demands framed as concern. Accusations disguised as confusion. I didn't answer. I stood in the hallway, listening, cataloging tone and timing the way I used to catalog risk on construction sites. This wasn't panic yet. This was entitlement colliding with resistance. They knocked, then pounded, then tried the locks one by one. Nothing opened. Eventually they left. Tires on asphalt. A door slamming harder than necessary. Silence returning in uneven waves. I slept that night with the kind of rest that comes only after a line has been drawn and held. The next day passed quietly. No calls. No messages. I spent the morning making copies, physical and digital, of everything that mattered. I organized folders. I labeled drives. I removed originals from the house and placed them where emotion couldn't reach them. That evening, Ryan came back alone. He didn't knock. He tested the door first, rattling the handle hard enough to announce intent. When that failed, he shouted. Not my name this time, but accusations. Threats dressed up as promises. He said he would return. He said he would bring tools. He said the house wasn't really mine anymore. I listened without responding. When he finally left, the quiet felt different. Taut, like the pause before something breaks. I didn't feel afraid. I felt resolved. What they had crossed wasn't a financial line or a legal one. It was personal. They had mistaken my silence for consent, my patience for weakness, my illness for surrender. By changing the locks, I hadn't provoked them. I had exposed them. And once people realize they've been seen, they rarely retreat gracefully. I didn't make the call right away. After Megan and Ryan left the night before. After the shouting, the pounding, the way Ryan's voice shifted from concern to ownership, I needed the house to go quiet again. Not because I was shaken, but because clarity requires stillness. I had learned that years ago, back when mistakes cost people their livelihoods instead of their pride. The morning came slowly. Pale light filtered through the front windows, catching dust in the air that I hadn't noticed before. I made coffee and drank it standing up, not because I was restless, but because sitting felt premature. There was work to do. I laid everything out again on the dining table, but this time I wasn't looking for confirmation. I already had that. I was preparing to translate what I knew into something that couldn't be dismissed as paranoia, age, or emotion. Truth is fragile when it lives only in one person's head. I needed it to exist independently of me. That was when I called Laura. We had worked together more than a decade earlier, back when my life revolved around contracts, compliance audits, and making sure nothing collapsed under the weight of small, ignored errors. Laura had never been sentimental. She didn't soften bad news or exaggerate good news. She dealt in structure, not reassurance. Over the years, we'd stayed in touch just enough to know each other still existed, still thought clearly. She answered on the second ring. I didn't tell her it was urgent. I didn't dramatize. I asked if she could look at something hypothetical. That alone was enough to signal that it wasn't. She arrived an hour later with nothing but a notebook and her glasses. No questions, no commentary. She took a seat at the table as if this were a scheduled review instead of a personal collapse disguised as family concern. I handed her the first stack: bank statements, card usage, timelines. She read silently, pen moving only when something deserved marking. Then the emails. Then the trust documents. When she reached the preliminary filing with Ryan's name on it, she didn't react outwardly. She just paused longer than before. Finally, the signature. She compared it carefully, not with outrage but with curiosity. She asked for older samples, so I brought them. She lined them up side by side, tracing patterns with the tip of her pen without touching the paper. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the refrigerator cycle on and off. After nearly 40 minutes, she leaned back. "This isn't confusion," she said. I waited. Laura never wasted words. "This isn't entitlement either," she continued. "Those usually come with sloppiness. This is planning." She slid the papers into a clean stack and tapped them once, as if closing a file. "The timing isn't coincidental. The financial activity increases when your health records show hospital visits. The filing appears when you're medically unavailable. The language in the emails shifts from suggestion to assumption. Whoever did this expected no resistance." She looked at me directly then. "They assumed you were already out of the picture." That sentence landed heavier than anything Megan or Ryan had shouted the night before. Not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. I asked Laura what she would do next if this were her case. She didn't hesitate. "First, you stop being the only person who knows," she said. "Isolation is the foundation of every maneuver like this. Second, you prepare for escalation. People don't abandon plans like this quietly. They double down." She began outlining steps, not advice but procedure. Copies of everything, digital and physical, stored in more than one location. Time-stamped backups, a formal comparison analysis of the forged signature, a pre-filed trespass notice, documentation of threats, even implied ones. She didn't say call the police or confront them or protect yourself emotionally. She focused on what would survive scrutiny. "This kind of situation collapses the moment it's exposed to neutral review," she said. "They'll try to change the story once they realize you're not alone. They'll say they were helping, that you were confused, that this was for your own good." She paused, then added, "Those narratives only work if no one is checking." Before she left, she gathered her things and stood by the door, her hand resting briefly on the frame like she was grounding herself. "You did the right thing by not reacting emotionally," she said. "Most people don't. That's usually why this works." After she was gone, I didn't sit down right away. I stood in the hallway and let the house settle around me. For the first time since this had begun, I felt something loosen in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart condition. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't overreacting. And I wasn't alone. I followed Laura's instructions exactly. No shortcuts. No assumptions. By the end of the day, nothing important existed in only one place. Copies lived outside the house. Digital files were encrypted and timestamped. A record of Ryan's threats, voicemail tone, phrasing, escalation, was logged and saved. What shifted that day wasn't just my position. It was the story. Up until then, Megan and Ryan controlled the narrative by default. Concerned daughter, helpful son-in-law, aging father. That framework depended on me staying quiet and accommodating, on my reluctance to embarrass them or escalate matters publicly. Laura's involvement cracked that frame cleanly in half. Because once professionals get involved, people who don't benefit from your silence, the truth stops being personal. It becomes procedural. And procedure doesn't care how loud someone shouts on a porch. That evening, I sat in the living room with the lights off, watching the street through the front window. I wasn't waiting for them to return. I was thinking about how people behave when they realize their private certainty has been interrupted. They push, they test, they try to reassert control as quickly as possible. And in doing so, they almost always reveal more than they intend. By the time Megan and Ryan came back later that night, voices raised, confusion turning sharp at the locked door. Everything that mattered was already documented, duplicated, and secured somewhere they couldn't reach. They still thought this was a family dispute. I knew better. By the time night came again, the house no longer felt like a place I was defending. Felt like a place I had reclaimed. That distinction mattered more than I expected. Defense is reactive. Reclamation is deliberate. One leaves you exhausted. The other steadies your hands. I spent most of that day doing things that looked ordinary from the outside. Cooked. Cleaned. I sorted old mail. But underneath the routine, every action had a purpose. I was removing uncertainty from my environment. I was making sure that nothing inside these walls could be misinterpreted later as confusion or neglect. I reviewed the timeline Laura and I had assembled, not because I doubted it, but because repetition sharpens awareness. Megan's increasing involvement in my finances had begun just after my first hospitalization. Ryan's presence in conversations about property and long-term planning appeared soon after. They hadn't rushed. They had waited until my health provided them with what they believed was justification. That was the hidden truth they didn't understand they had revealed. They believed illness transferred authority. They believed vulnerability meant forfeiture. I documented that belief carefully. By mid-afternoon, I had spoken to my attorney, not to initiate action, but to establish record. There is a difference. I explained the situation plainly. I didn't accuse. I described dates, documents, behavior. He listened without interrupting, then asked me to send copies. When he spoke again, his tone had changed. Not alarmed, but alert. "This was handled correctly," he said. "You didn't confront them. You didn't escalate emotionally. That matters." He advised me to prepare for confrontation anyway. Not verbally, procedurally. I followed his guidance to the letter. I pre-filed a trespass notice, the same way one files an insurance claim before a storm reaches land. I notified local authorities not because I expected immediate action, but because I wanted a time-stamped record of concern tied to prior behavior and explicit threats. The officer I spoke with didn't ask why I was doing this. He didn't need to. Systems don't require explanations, only inputs. I informed my insurance provider of potential forced entry risk. I upgraded coverage. I documented communications. I made sure that if anything happened, the narrative wouldn't begin with speculation. It would begin with preparation. What Megan and Ryan didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that every step they had taken so far assumed I was still emotionally engaged, that I was hoping for reconciliation, that I wanted them to come back, apologize, and restore the illusion of family harmony. I didn't. Once that desire disappears, leverage shifts quietly but completely. As evening approached, I received a message from Megan. It wasn't an apology. It was confusion weaponized as concern. "Why are you doing this? Ryan is worried about you. This isn't like you." I read it once. Then I archived it. No response. Silence is not cruelty when it prevents distortion. Any reply would have invited negotiation, explanation, reinterpretation. I had no interest in any of that. Around dusk, a neighbor I trusted stopped by on his evening walk. I told him calmly that there might be noise later and that if he heard anything concerning, I would appreciate him recording it from his porch. He didn't pry. He nodded once and said he'd keep his phone charged. Mutual respect doesn't require elaboration. By the time darkness settled fully, the house was quiet but alert. Lights were set on timers. Doors locked. Windows secured. I sat in the living room with a clear view of the street, not pacing, not tense, just present. At 8:17 p.m., Ryan's truck appeared at the end of the block. He didn't park immediately. He slowed, rolled past the house, circled the block, then came back. That behavior told me everything I needed to know. He was assessing, not visiting, testing whether resolve had softened with time. When he finally stopped at the curb, I noticed what he carried before he stepped fully into the light. An axe, not raised, not brandished, just held with casual menace, like a statement he expected would end the conversation before it began. In his mind, intimidation was still a currency that worked. I didn't move toward the door yet. I let him approach it, let him test the handle, let him shout. His voice was different now, less theatrical, more aggressive. He spoke about ownership, about rights, about how this would go if I didn't stop being difficult. I listened not as a father, but as an observer. This was the moment Laura had warned me about. The escalation, the push for control once quiet methods failed. When he lifted the axe, not to swing but to demonstrate that he could, I stood and walked to the door. My movements were slow, deliberate, not defiant, certain. I placed my hand on the lock. I didn't feel fear. I felt timing. Everything that mattered was already in place. Documentation, witnesses, records, alerts. The truth was no longer fragile. It no longer depended on my voice or my strength. When I opened the door, I didn't step outside. I opened the door before the moment could be taken from me. Not abruptly, not to surprise him. I turned the lock, pulled the door inward, and stopped at the threshold without crossing it. I stayed exactly where the house ended and the night began. My feet planted on what I had paid for, maintained, and defended longer than Ryan had known my daughter. The air outside was sharp, carrying the metallic smell of the tool in his hands. He stood there expecting chaos, fear, shouting, retreat. People who rely on intimidation need movement from the other side. They need reaction. What unsettled him wasn't what stood behind me. It was what didn't. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gesture. I didn't acknowledge the acts at all. I let silence do the work first. Silence is disorienting when someone has rehearsed a threat. Behind me, the house was fully lit. Not dramatically, intentionally. The living room lights spilled outward, revealing more than Ryan had anticipated. He had come prepared to dominate a private moment. What he encountered instead was exposure. Uniformed officers stood just inside, not crowding, not posturing. Calm, still, present because they had already been called, because the record already existed, because this was not a spontaneous dispute, it was the continuation of a documented pattern. A neighbor across the street stood on his porch, phone raised, recording without commentary, not interfering, witnessing. I felt no triumph in that moment, only alignment. Everything was where it needed to be. Ryan's certainty fractured quietly, not with panic but with recalculation. He had expected me to be alone, cornered, forced into a choice between surrender and escalation. He hadn't considered a third option, that I had already moved past him. The axe lowered before anyone spoke. Gravity took it the rest of the way. The sound it made when it hit the concrete wasn't dramatic, just final, a tool rendered irrelevant by context. The officers didn't rush him. They didn't need to. Authority doesn't need to hurry when it arrives on time. They acknowledged the situation as it was, not as anyone wanted it to be framed. A pre-filed trespass notice, documented threats, attempted forced entry, supporting evidence already logged. Ryan tried to explain himself. Not loudly, not convincingly. The words fell into the space between us and dissolved there. Explanations don't travel well once behavior has been preserved on record. Megan arrived minutes later, breathless, her concern sharp and unfocused. She saw the scene and froze, not because of fear, but because recognition had finally caught up with her. This wasn't about family anymore. It wasn't about helping. It wasn't even about control. It was about accountability. She tried to approach me, her expression shifting toward familiarity, toward the role that had always worked before. I didn't step forward. I didn't step back. I stayed where I was. Distance, I had learned, is not cruelty. It's clarity. What she saw then wasn't anger or hurt. It was resolve. And resolve doesn't negotiate. The officers handled the rest with quiet efficiency. Names recorded. Statements taken. Conditions explained. Ryan wasn't arrested that night, and I hadn't expected him to be. Justice, when it's done properly, rarely arrives with spectacle. It arrives with limits. When they left, the street returned to its ordinary silence. The neighbor across the way lowered his phone and gave a small nod before going back inside. No one clapped. No one lingered. I closed the door and locked it. Inside, the house felt unchanged. That mattered too. I didn't need it to feel victorious. I needed it to feel intact. I sat down in the same chair I had positioned earlier and let my breathing slow naturally. My heart behaved itself. Not because the situation was easy, but because it was finished. What Ryan never understood, and what Megan had been too close to see, was that the confrontation wasn't the door opening. The confrontation had happened days earlier, quietly, in documentation, preparation, and refusal to perform distress on demand. Tonight was just the acknowledgement. They had come expecting resistance. They left with reality. And reality, once it asserts itself, doesn't need to shout. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. Not empty, just settled. The kind of quiet that comes after something has been decided beyond revision. I didn't replay the night Ryan came with the axe. I didn't rehearse alternative outcomes or imagine different words I could have used. Rumination is a luxury for people who doubt their own judgment. I didn't. The legal process moved forward without my involvement beyond what was necessary. That was intentional. I didn't attend meetings out of curiosity. I didn't read filings for satisfaction. I answered questions when asked and provided documentation when requested. Nothing more. The machinery worked as it was designed to work once the inputs were clean. Ryan kept his distance. That too mattered. Distance is the clearest admission people make when they know the ground no longer favors them. Megan tried once, just once, to reopen communication through a carefully worded message that framed everything as a misunderstanding born of stress and fear. I archived it without replying. Not out of spite, out of accuracy. Misunderstandings resolve themselves when both sides share the same facts. This wasn't that. I focused instead on my health. I kept my appointments. I took my medication on schedule. I walked the neighborhood in the mornings. The air cool and forgiving. My pace unhurried. Recovery isn't dramatic. It's repetitive. It's choosing the same small disciplines every day because they add up to stability. The house adjusted to me again. Not the other way around. I moved furniture I had tolerated for years because it suited someone else's visits. I cleared drawers that had become repositories for other people's assumptions. I replaced things that had been chosen for optics with things chosen for use. Each small change was a statement, though no one was there to hear it. I changed nothing about the locks. That decision wasn't symbolic. It was practical. Locks exist to define responsibility. They say where access begins and ends. For too long, I had relied on shared understanding to do the work of hardware. I wouldn't make that mistake again. Occasionally, people asked questions, neighbors, acquaintances, distant relatives who had heard fragments and wanted a story they could categorize. I didn't provide one. I said only that there had been a boundary issue and that it had been resolved. That was true. Anything more would have been decoration. What surprised me most wasn't the absence of my daughter's voice. It was how little space that absence occupied once I stopped explaining it to myself. Grief demands attention when it's fed with hope. When hope is withdrawn, grief becomes manageable. It doesn't vanish. It just takes its proper size. I didn't seek apologies. I didn't ask for acknowledgement. Accountability doesn't require an audience. It requires consequence, and that had already been delivered in the only language that mattered. Limits enforced, access revoked, narratives corrected. One afternoon, while sorting through an old box in the closet, I found photographs from years earlier. Megan as a child, laughing without reservation. Me behind the camera, steady hands, patient presence. I sat with those images for a while, not to mourn what was lost, but to honor what had been real at the time. People change. That doesn't retroactively invalidate what came before. It just means you stop extending it into the present. I put the photos back and closed the box. The final paperwork arrived without ceremony. The attempted amendments were voided. The forged elements flagged. The trust remained intact. My affairs, once again, reflected my intentions rather than someone else's expectations. There was no moment of triumph when I read the confirmation. Just a quiet sense of alignment. This was how it was supposed to be. On an evening much like the one that had started all of this, cool air, lights on in the living room, the neighborhood calm, I sat in the same chair by the front window, not watching for anyone, just present. The house felt neither guarded nor exposed. Felt owned. Dignity, I learned, isn't reclaimed loudly. It doesn't require confrontation or victory speeches. It's restored the moment you stop asking permission to exist in your own space. The moment you trust your own assessment enough to act on it. The moment you accept that some doors, once closed, are meant to remain that way. I left a few unlocked.